noon, and today we're taking a moment of silence to commemorate the victims of last week's event here in Portland. So. Welcome to another session of our Friday Transportation Seminar. I'm Dr. Jenny Liu, and I host the seminar along with my colleague, Dr. Kelly Clifton, who is not here today. And today we're very happy to welcome Dr. Chris Cherry, who is an associate professor at the University of Tennessee, and his research really focuses on sustainable transportation, and especially he just completed a large project on emerging technologies in transportation in China. So we're very happy to have him here today, and I am going to turn the floor over to him right now.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'm very happy to be in beautiful Portland. Wonderful time of year, I think, it sounds like, and a wonderful weekend also. So today I'm going to talk about this kind of new wave of technologies that's been emerging in China over the last, say, decade or so, with a pretty significant focus on looking at some of the sustainability impacts of these transportation technologies. And then near the end of the seminar, we'll talk a little bit about how sort of behavioral shifts kind of translate to environmental sustainability impacts, looking at electric vehicles, light electric vehicles like electric bikes, some other technologies like Bikeshare, Ebikeshare, or some other things like that. So we'll go through that kind of one by one, starting with kind of the background, and then we'll get into the sustainability part, and then we'll close from there. Okay? Before I jump into that, let me just acknowledge the main students. There's a lot of students that helped with this, a lot of institutions, but the main grad students that kind of use this sort of work for their dissertations and other things were Zouwen Ling, she's still my PhD student at UT. Luke Jones is in economics now at Valdosta State, a faculty member there. Hong Taiyang, Southwest Jiaotong University faculty member now, and then Andrew Campbell was one of our master's students now, PhD student at Berkeley, who did some of this work. Okay, and a lot of, as I said, as before, a lot of this work was funded by NSF multi-year career award to study behavior and sustainability in transportation. So let's jump in. Quick, just context, there's been a lot of talk about motorization in China over the last decades, really, but really in the last 10 to 15 years, there's been this understanding that China is motorizing fast, very fast, and it has a significant consequence for global climate, for global emissions, for global energy, and a number of other things, even economics. It was one of the pillars of China, one of China's 5-year plans, a few 5-year plans ago, that the automotive industry was going to be one of the sort of main economic pillars for their economy. And so this is an old 2010, 2007 article that looked at these different motorization curves over time, and some people probably recognize this sort of S curve. And China is on the bottom left. You can see how China's kind of tracked with other developing Asian countries. And there's this expectation that China was just going to keep going along the S curve until they got to kind of U.S. levels of motorization, or at least this question of whether that would happen. And there's also this other counter question that says China can't possibly motorize to the same rate that the U.S. has. They don't have the room, they don't have the resources, they don't have the energy or any of that. And we've had, since then, a lot of disruptive type technologies that have come in and kind of changed the landscape of transportation. Yet, here we are. I've put the little star there where China's motorization rate is now, or most recently, and it kind of falls along the curve, okay? So it hasn't really departed yet from that curve, and the question is when will it, if it will, and so on, okay? So there's a couple of things that are important. These so-called disruptive technologies, can they shift the curve? Car sharing, bike sharing, electric vehicles, electric motorcycles, electric scooters emerging into connected autonomous vehicles, other things. The question is, can these new technologies really shift how people behave? And that was something that we kind of set out to answer those questions. We didn't answer all of them, of course. We didn't find the magic bullets or any of those. But a couple of takeaways that are important to note, I think, is in the first is that e-bikes, electric assist bikes, are the fastest, largest growth of an alternative fuel vehicle in the history of motorization. Okay, about 200 million have sold. More than 200 million have sold over the last decade, and that's more than there are commuters in the United States, for example. Okay, so when you think about the volume of displaced VMT, let's say, if these are all displacing different types of modes, that's a big shift in kind of the mode and vehicle technology space that's occurred. Okay, the passenger cars, the big story on passenger cars is the blue line, but that's kind of paled in comparison to these electric bikes. And when I'm talking about electric bikes in the Chinese market, picture some Frankenstein vehicle between a bicycle and a scooter. Okay, there's form factor elements along that entire spectrum, but fundamentally they're the same technology. They're two wheels mostly. They have pedals mostly. They have a battery and a motor, and that's what they look like. Okay. The other part is that e-bikes are the most energy efficient vehicles that exist. Not counting, well, when you talk about bicycles, but they're the most energy efficient motorized vehicle that exists. And they're about twice as energy efficient as a Chinese bus full of people, 4 times as energy efficient as a gasoline motorcycle, and 10 to 20 times as energy efficient as an electric car or a conventional car in terms of energy and CO2 per. Yes. Yep. Great. No problem. Okay. Got it. So tell me if it works when you get a chance, or don't tell me if it doesn't. It does work, I guess. Okay, so they're extremely energy efficient because they have an electric drive system, which is one of the more energy efficient drive systems that we know of course. And the most of the energy is moving the person, not the vehicle. Okay, and that's the key takeaway there. Okay, so between these two factors, or between this energy factor and other factors, they're generally kind of a well received in many circles, but there's also controversy about safety and other things, which I could get into, but that would be a different track. We can get into that at lunchtime or afterwards if you want to talk about that. So the big question that we might ask is, compared to what? What are the benefits compared to? Not everybody. Many people I talk to related to e-bikes talk to me about, well, they're worse than bicycles. Why would you ever say an e-bike is a good thing when a bicycle is better? Okay. The question is, what is the e-bike really displacing? And that's what the types of questions we ask when we're talking about this shift in mobility and this substitution pattern. So kind of ignore the left. That's kind of a context slide. We ask these questions over now 10, 12 years. From 2006, every 2 years, we do a new cross-section in the same city, same sampling approach. And we try to sample the same populations, essentially, every 2 years. And we've done the survey over this last decade, starting with my dissertation in 2006 and continuing onward. Okay? And what we found is this sort of, we're trying to get at this substitution question, and we asked this question on the right. If you did not have your e-bike for a specific trip in your travel diary, we do a travel diary and we ask this question, what mode of transportation would you choose for this trip? So then we can start talking about displaced vehicle kilometer traveled and so on. And what we see is these two here, arrows that are kind of the important, or the interesting ones. The important one is transit, okay? more than 50% of the e-bike riders on the street in Kunming, which is a somewhat representative city, are displacing transit trips. Okay? And that could be a good or a bad thing. If you ride the bus at peak hour in most Chinese cities, you find that it's oversubscribed, you're waiting in lines, there's no room, and so on. So this is pulling some of the load from that. But the more interesting part is the green one, and that's bicycle if you can't read it. And the sort of substituted bicycle trips has been going down by and large over time with this new little development on the right. And then the car-based trips, the substituted car-based trips, has been going up over time. Again, the last 2 years has seen this kind of drop. We saw a big drop in 2014. We were wondering if there's an anomaly. We did it again in 2016, and we found it persisted. So we're interested in that. That's kind of an interesting new part of the story. Is it used to be, or at least for the first sort of 4 sets of surveys, that e-bikes were substituting a lot of car trips, like the second car trip, the trip that the two-worker household would take the car, one person take the car, one person take the e-bike, and up to about a quarter of all e-bike trips were substituted car trips. Now it's back down to about a little over 10%, and this is taxi, this is Uber equivalent Didi, and other modes. Okay, and on the far right, you'll notice this big jump in other. In the span of the last 2 surveys, the subway was built and installed, or at least a good part of it. Aaron? Yeah.
Do people drive the e-bikes in the traffic lanes?
Mostly no.
Okay.
The question for the audience was, do e-bikes ride in the traffic lanes? The kind of legacy bike infrastructure has persisted in many cities, in most cities, I would say. And China really has kind of world-class bike infrastructure that they've been building for decades. I was in Shanghai last week, and even in the far-out suburb, Auto City, they call it, they have very decent separated bike lanes. I wouldn't call it perfect, but really decent separated infrastructure. Okay, so that leads to the question about where they belong in the infrastructure, how fast they should go. Do they impose added risk to the bicyclists, which they do? Does that counter the risk of the e-bike riders with the mixed with the cars? Okay, so those are all big questions that I don't have the perfect answer to. Okay, but the subway has been grabbing sort of a lot of potential trips too in this farthest right panel, and that may account for some of the changes in the car-based substitution, which is kind of interesting. The other little tidbit here is the bikes have jumped up from almost full irrelevance to partial irrelevance. That is, they're making a little bit of a resurgence. There's some anecdote that bikes are cool again, and I'll share a little bit about that in a minute. Okay. The other part is this question of car ownership and car purchase intention. These green and so the left side is ownership of all these different types of vehicles, left side of that blue dashed line there on the bottom. So over 50% of households in our sample own cars at home, yet they still use e-bikes for all these trips. So that's an interesting observation, and that accounts for that sort of car substitution finding. More people own cars in their household than own bicycles, and that happened a few years ago in our survey sample, which is kind of an interesting transition. You have car ownership rates higher than bicycle ownership rates in households in Kunming, in our sample at least. Okay, everybody owns an e-bike, of course, because we're surveying e-bike riders, and just a few people own motorcycles. Motorcycles have these strict restrictions against them and so on. To the right, we ask about car purchase intention for their first or second car. The blue line is their first car. The blue line is their second car. The orange is their first car. So we have this high level of car purchase intention. Everybody who's intending to buy a car, whether they actually do is a different question. E-bike purchase intention has kind of been going down over time, okay? But still kind of sustaining. Again, everybody has an e-bike that we're surveying. Okay, so we did this study on purchase intention of cars, different types of cars, if you want to dig in a little more. Kunming is this bottom left here. I'll follow directions. It's down here. And the rest of these cities, we did a telephone interview across China to ask some of these similar questions. We didn't have the really high-level network data, so we couldn't do information about travel diaries and other things, but we really were looking at what we really wanted to get was this question of vehicle transition over time. That is, do people start at a bicycle, go to an e-bike, eventually buy a car? Do e-bikes hasten that transition? Do they delay that transition? What we found is we couldn't get enough longitudinal data, basically. Everything's happening so fast that everybody's still on their first car, everybody's still on their first, not everybody, but much of our sample is still on their first e-bike. There hasn't been enough of a turnover of vehicles in the household fleets yet to really do any interesting modeling there. But nonetheless, that was something we looked at. And you can read about it in this article on the right here. Okay? So other technology, we did this, we were looking at Bikeshare also, and car share. So we developed this nice stated preference, revealed preference survey instrument where we, still using pen and paper, we pivot existing stated preference trips off of existing trips, kind of a dual mode, where it becomes a kind of very pure stated preference survey, and trying to understand the role of Bikeshare and e-bikes in the transportation in the Bikeshare transportation system. Okay, and what we found, don't ignore the big table on the left, but what we basically found was that e-bike riders, e-bike in Bikeshare serves a different purpose. Okay, that is, e-bike riders, would-be e-bike riders, would choose e-bikes in Bikeshare more often on bad weather days, on hot days, on bad air quality days, which is like every day in most Chinese cities. They would replace sheltered modes more often, which is transit, car, taxi, all relative to conventional Bikeshare. So the takeaway message from this study was that e-bikes in Bikeshare are not just another vehicle that provide a little bit more utility. They actually replace and displace different types of trips. Okay, and distance also is important. You see on the top right, again, it's probably too small to see in the back. Sorry about that. But e-bike share trips were much longer, displaced much longer trips than conventional bike share trips. And that's an important finding too, is that if your cities are expanding, destinations are spreading out across cities, e-bike share would replace trips for those longer trips than conventional bike share. Okay, so I was in Shanghai last week. Has anybody been tracking the Bikes controversy in San Francisco and so on? Shanghai has been flooded by so a couple of observations, and this is not research, but this is purely observations I made over the last week and talking with others. But I had my Chinese friends on WeChat when I was over there telling me, "Oh, have you seen the new e-bike or the new bike share bikes in different cities all over China? Oh, they're so great. I'm using them now. It's amazing, high tech." And there are these tech companies investing hundreds of millions of dollars in OFO and Mobike, wherever Mobike is over there. I didn't put that picture in very well. And suddenly, bike share is kind of part of the tech landscape, the tech revolution. You use your phone to check it out. And the bike share systems of the last few years have been these sort of big government institutionalized modes of transportation, and they've been very successful. They've expanded extremely well in China. But these are really kind of revolutionary in a sense that they're completely private sector. They're dumped on cities, essentially, creating havoc, and that's one of the challenges for San Francisco that they're trying to address. One of the industry experts I interact with sometimes calls them helter-skelter bikes. They're just everywhere. And these companies are putting them all over. This was a picture outside of a subway station. They're just starting to overflow, get stacked on top of each other to keep the walkway clear. This is at the maglev station, so it's a big hub. They had somebody actually shuffling these around, making sure they were all tightened together. And they had the OFO side, which is one big company, and then they had the Mobike side on the other side. And then throughout Shanghai, I've got dozens of pictures like this. You see the top right. Let me see. I count I counted 1, 2, 3, 4 brands of Bikeshare bike, all just sort of placed on the same block. So if you're a subscriber to one of these, you can walk up and pick whichever one you subscribe to, and then every street in the core of Shanghai has this sort of bikes sort of helter-skelter around, okay? This one on the far back corner there is actually this one on the bottom right, all right? So this little bike here happens to be this one, and what an observer might notice with this one is it has a battery and a motor. This is an electric Bikeshare bike that is stationless, placed wherever the rider would end his or her trip, and has created kind of an interesting model. Okay, so these require personnel. People got to go out and swap batteries and do a lot of work to keep these ones running. And there's a few questions on whether this is a viable model or not. We'll find out. Okay, so the interesting part of this, though, the thing that I was struck by is people from all socioeconomic strata. The street sweeper was noticing me, observing these, and was getting all excited and telling me about these new bikes that have come, and they're all part of this ecosystem of technology and innovation. Up to the university professors at the conference I was at were saying, "Oh, these things are amazing. These are so interesting, and they're part. Oh, you know, Tencent has invested $300 million in this company, and so is invested in this other one." So suddenly, e-bikes are part of a high-tech mode of transportation, or Bikeshare rather. Bikes are being used everywhere, and these are, you know, you see these pictures of bike parking full again of conventional bicycles, and that's pretty interesting and exciting, I think, in terms of my perspective. Okay, you've seen this decline over the last decades of bike parking being turned into car parking or electric scooter parking, and the parking lots would be it'd be rare to find a working bicycle in a lot of these places. Okay, that's changing, and that's, I think, a good thing if some of the helter-skelter part can be managed better. Okay, all right. So we looked at car share also. This is a study that was published this year, and a couple things related to car share. Again, everything's evolving quickly, so you know, we did a similar sort of state of preference experiment. We found that car share, as expected, pulled people from transit, especially group travelers. If you're traveling with someone, with a group, you would take a car share instead of a conventional, or instead of the transit. Some parking issues and other things. Weather indicators we controlled for. If you lived in a gated community, like a gated residential community, that was sort of attractive to car share. There were some nonprofits that were working towards getting car share in gated communities and so on. There's a couple of other findings that are notable. One is that we tried to control for whether an electric vehicle, just the fact that the car share was an electric vehicle would make it have higher utility, and the answer to that was, at least in our model, no. If it was an electric vehicle, they could care less, so long as it had the same level of performance. And then we tried to control for status as well by having experiments where the car, we showed them pictures of what the car share car would look like, and we have different pictures, one with the big blazoned, branded decal on the side that says car share car, and then the other one was an anonymous, just a regular car. And that didn't show up either, so at any rate, we were trying to kind of capture some of these maybe subtle social cues on whether these new technologies were good or not. Okay, all right. So, quick shift to the environment, as I mentioned. Let me watch the time. Really, one of these, the main question for this study was, how do these shifts in technology shift behavior, and if they shift behavior in a certain way, how does that influence the environmental performance of the transportation system? Okay, rather than just saying, like we maybe do in the U.S., if I get a Nissan Leaf or a Nissan Versa, my footprint will be this. Okay, and it'll be a one-to-one shift. Here we're looking at these kind of new technologies kind of coming in the process of this motorization process, and that's creating some differences. Okay. All right. So we did this LCA framework in China. We used this China. Sorry, we went too quick there. Where we looked at the entire life cycle of different types of vehicles, and we're still in the process of doing this. We've got some findings, but not solid findings all the way yet. Okay. But we looked. One of the issues is China's manufacturing processes are different than ours. Different than are in a lot of LCA software packages. So we rely a lot on the China Data Online. If you want to do work in China, this is like a really nice resource for statistics, industrial statistics, everything. They have it's coarse, it's aggregated, but it has a lot of good information nonetheless. And it's through University of Michigan. Well, it's the Bureau of Statistics funnels everything through the University of Michigan for the U.S. and they port it out. Okay, so we create these sort of spreadsheet-based kind of like the GREET 1.0 approach, where we have all these inputs and we have all these outputs and we have these impact factors, and we're trying to create all this. But the point is, with this, we can create region-specific EV emission rates. We can identify what proportion of the life cycle emissions are during manufacturing, for example, and so on. So we did this study and this is a few years back now. This is kind of right near the beginning of the grant. But we looked at electric vehicles in China, and we're wondering how to translate electric vehicle health risks, electric vehicle emissions to health risks, okay? And this is something you can do with kind of advanced atmospheric modeling, and we ended up using this intake fraction methodology. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's essentially the proportion of emissions, proportion of pollution emitted that is inhaled, okay? So if I inhale 1 milligram of PM, particulate matter, and 1 kilogram is emitted, I have 1 to the -6 intake fraction, okay? That's 1 part per million, okay? And so China has a different intake fraction relationship with power plant emissions than the U.S. And it has that because, predominantly because there's a lot of population. There's a lot of people breathing, okay? And there's a lot of intake of ambient air. And so that results in a high intake fraction. There's a lot of people that live next to power plants in China. There's a very rural economy. So even if the power plants are away from cities, they're still now just less than half of the 1.34 billion people live in those rural areas. So there's a different relationship than you might find in the U.S., where you have a power plant potentially out in the countryside. Okay, so we're looking at that. We looked at that, and what we found is this. So focus on the left side. This is the first part that's important, is the emission rates. This is grams per person kilometer. So this is different modes of transportation. PM 2.5 and CO2, just to show two that are important, most important we think. And the E-car is this little cloud up on the top right. And the important part of that cloud is some places are very clean. Some grids are cleaner, I should say. And some grids are very dirty. 100% coal, practically. And not just coal, but unregulated, dirty coal. Okay? And obviously, China's been shifting dramatically over the last few years. And so this is going to change this chart. But with the data we're looking at here is kind of striking. And the key finding here, the one that Rush Limbaugh jumped on, was that electric cars emit more than gasoline cars for PM 2.5. Okay? And that's pretty bad. And that's what you might expect, actually, what people who work in emissions know. Gasoline cars don't emit a lot of PM 2.5. Coal does, okay? And so they emitted a lot, but we had to scale it back. A couple more points. E-bikes are down here on the bottom left, this little cloud. So e-bikes, even the dirtiest e-bike is clean relative to other modes of transportation. That is the e-bike that draws from 100% dirty coal power, and that's because, remember, it's very energy efficient, okay? So we stepped up and looked at exposure. And what we found across the main cities that we looked at, 34 cities, was that exposure ranged from 1 to 1 to 1 to more than 1 to 10. And on average, weighted average, what that meant was that you could reduce the exposure and health impacts by a factor of 5 just because you took all that pollution and you put it out in the countryside, essentially. Took it out of the city. So if you're comparing a gasoline car that's got this tailpipe emitting into people's faces in a city, and you've got a power plant, even though you still have population surrounding that power plant, it's much better from that perspective of exposure to move the pollution out. Okay, so we reduce our emissions by a factor of 5, or our exposure in a sense, and then you end up with mortality impacts. The left two panels are the ones to pay attention to here. We have gasoline cars versus electric cars, and we find that electric cars have higher mortality impacts than gasoline cars for PM 2.5. What that means is for the same VMT traveled for electric vehicles across these main cities, electric vehicles are worse for public health at this point than gasoline cars. Okay? Electric bikes, on the other hand, remember this is getting to the point of substitution patterns, do much better, a factor of 2 or so. Okay? So that's a good thing. But not all cities are very bad for electric bikes and electric cars. If you look at the top here along this sort of 45 line, that's kind of the point where cities are approaching equality in terms of health impacts. Okay? So that was kind of the main finding, and of course they're different across different cities. And we had a different follow-up study that looked at people that emitted the pollution versus people that inhaled the pollution, which is when you have electric vehicle policies, you're exporting pollution from cities where people are wealthier in general, on average, and that pollution is being inhaled by people in rural counties where the well-being, where welfare is much lower, across a lot of metrics. Okay, so you look at the wealth of China per capita is the left map along the coast, and then you have some high wealth per capita up in the desert where you don't have many per capitas. You have a lot of production, but not a lot of people doing that production. Okay. You have in the second one, you have per capita inhalation from power plants. You see a couple of little blobs that are not really on the coast. Okay, this one in the middle, this is kind of a dirty stretch through Chongqing province and so on. And then on the right, you have this. Let me make sure I read it right. The population density. So you can see how some of these maps sort of overlay, and you can start to see where some of the impacts are born from urban EVs. And what we found is basically in the 34 cities in the case study, you had relatively high-income counties and relatively low-income counties. And then you have the places where and each of these dots represents PM inhalation across population. So you have a lot of red here, which basically means a lot of the pollution that's emitted from the EVs in these little average cities, these green triangles, is inhaled by all of these population, all these people that are in much lower income counties. So these are what we call the disadvantaged people and the advantaged people. Okay, there are people that still inhale in high income counties, but not nearly at the rate of the low income counties. All right, a couple of little factoids, I guess. 77% of EV emissions are inhaled by more rural, less affluent populations. 5% of EV urban emissions are inhaled by the lowest 10% income counties. Okay, and so on. All right. So, kind of the recommendations. EVs are taking off this year and last were kind of boom years for electric cars in China. They finally kind of came in full speed after several years of trying. And some recommendations are even dirty e-bikes are cleaner than all other motorized modes. The first study I showed got a lot of press because it showed a lot of, you can say good and bad press depending on your perspective, because it showed that EVs
had a ways to go to become a sustainable, clean vehicle, right? E-cars require a lot of energy to move still, and if that energy is generated from coal power, we quantified that it emits a lot more pollution and ultimate health impacts, okay? So the parallel step is cleaning up the coal sector, and it seems like China is getting very serious about that. So what we found also is technologies that reduce urban car use can help. Shared cars, bikes, e-bikes. There's not an affinity away from EVs in a shared car environment. There's not a negative perception of EVs. We've got some follow-up studies on trying to understand if e-bikes contribute to a positive or a negative perception of e-cars. Okay, so think of this, 200 million or more Chinese residents now have had personal experience using an e-vehicle. They think about range anxiety. They think about where to plug in. They think about performance of the vehicle in relation to something. Okay, and so they know about charging infrastructure, and they know about the concept, at least, of charging infrastructure. They know about trying to understand when to charge, how to charge, what my range is, and so on. So there's this question of whether someone with an e-bike would be more inclined to have a favorable view of e-cars, battery electric cars. What we found is preliminary yet. We haven't worked out all the details yet, but our initial finding is that no, they actually have a less favorable view of electric cars, but a more favorable view of plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. Okay, so they know about range anxiety. They know they've been stranded before on their e-bikes. And they need some sort of insurance to get them into that EV, which is a plug-in type of auxiliary unit, okay? Gas unit. Okay, so EVs are only getting cleaner. This is, again, you probably all know this, but the beautiful part about electric vehicles is they get cleaner with age in general in most areas. That is, the grid is getting cleaner, so they are. If personal cars are inevitable, e-cars have some promise, but I would argue that I don't think still that with these changes in technology that we're on this fast track to everybody in China owning a personal car, just because I think we see that there's constraints that are pushing against that model. Okay, and then the last one is that e-bikes and bike-share systems are more than just fancy bicycles. They're more than just bicycles for lazy people. They actually change the way people behave, and it'd be really interesting to get some empirical data from these new e-bikes in these floating bike share systems rather, to see if that's true or not, to see how people use those bikes. Okay. So with that, this is an article that came out, again, a couple of years ago. Can e-bikes displace cars? I really think that that's kind of one of the predominant questions in the U.S., in China, in Europe. If e-bikes are this sort of translational technology that can change the way we use personal mobility in urban areas, then that could be a good thing. Okay, if they just simply replace bicycles, we can argue about whether that's a good thing or not. Okay, so a couple other. This is just a little point. Is our next step, something that we're working on now, is trying to get a kind of integrated behavioral model with a life cycle assessment model, and trying to create this kind of probabilistic transition between decision systems and choice behavior, and the LCA model, basically. If I have an electric car, do I drive it just like I would have driven a gasoline car? And therefore, what is my environmental impact of owning an electric car versus not owning one? Okay, I think the naive model is if I buy the electric car, I'm going to use it just like I would have a gasoline car, and so we can talk about this in relationship to a lot of different technologies, whether it's car share, automated vehicles, et cetera. Okay, so with that, that's the end of it. Essentially, we again, like I said, this was funded much of this work, most of it I would say is funded by NSF. We're partnership with University of Tennessee, Monash University, and Portland State is this light electric vehicle education and research initiative. So we're really focusing on how these lightweight, low-speed electric vehicles interact with the transportation system. We have a website, you can check that out. And then the right thing here is these little micro EVs just for fun, or maybe big deal, who knows? You ask me in a few years, or go observe it in China yourself. But these little 1 or 2 seaters are starting to proliferate on Chinese roads. Again, they're very energy efficient. They're low speed, so they're relatively safe if you can find a place to fit them into the transportation system. Right now, they're kind of overwhelmingly adopted by old-timers. This little license plate translates roughly to old person instead of walking car. Okay, so provides mobility for the elderly. That's low speed, safer, and so on. And they're super energy efficient. If youngsters got excited about them, who knows? It could change things. Okay, so with that, questions.
Really interesting, lots of stuff to ask questions about, but I was thinking particularly about some of the stuff you presented at the end about the emissions and the power plants and EVs, et cetera, and particularly given everything going on right now with the Paris Accord and everything, and China's perhaps new role.
Yeah.
In that, have you looked, or how difficult would it be to sort of take your numbers and run a scenario if you, so the current power plant, coal plants are pretty dirty. There's existing technology that in theory could be installed to make them cleaner that would reduce emissions. So would it be that difficult to sort of run your numbers in a scenario of like what would it cost to actually get the EVs cleaner below or above that line? Or?
Yeah, so I would have to collaborate with someone in the power sector who would really know what it would cost to clean up the power grid. And there have been a few studies that have come out of China in the last couple of years that have looked at these different technologies and scenario planning. What if we, transformed 40% of our coal plants that are worth saving to some cleaner technology, got rid of these ones, and how would that change the emissions landscape? So yeah, the answer is.
From the environmental justice perspective, there's probably particular ones that would have a much bigger impact on who's breathing.
Yeah, absolutely. So we did do that on the environmental justice paper. We did the sensitivity analysis. I'm trying to remember exactly what the parameters we changed. We did something along the lines of what happens if you take the smallest plants out? What happens if you take the dirtiest plants out? How does that change? And by take them out, you replace them 100% with renewables, okay? So you still have to generate the electricity, but you don't emit, you remove the emission point source. And the challenge was let's see, there was some strange relationships because some of the dirtier plants were actually in the city because they're older, sort of dual heat power units. Some of the big clean ones were the ones that were out in the more rural area, the sort of more modern plants. So there was a few strange kind of relationships like that where if you changed one, it didn't actually do much for environmental justice, but it might have done more to reduce overall burden of health. Okay, and that's an interesting kind of point. I don't have the answer. The point of the question of the paper was, let's open the question and answer it correctly. Yeah, there's a lot in the power sector that's transforming so quickly that it makes me hopeful. Let's say that. Okay.
My question is about what do you think in China, particularly, if e-bike sharing is an efficient way rather than just limited to e-bike for people to own it, based on the space, because we saw gathered of e-bike sharing on transit. So does that make any problem there? First, another question is the batteries issue. Like, for example, people would like to have full charge, and how that will be efficient.
Yeah, so I'm not sure we did an electric bike share system at University of Tennessee as a little pilot test, and batteries was a big deal, trying to understand the battery management and trying to guarantee some minimum level of range for your bike share bike. So if you have somebody that's kind of like a high intensity user who requires long distance travel on an e-bike, they have to probably own their own vehicle. But most what we found in our bike share system, what we find with our trips on our surveys, is most people only use a very, very small fraction of the capacity of their battery every day. I think the daily tour is somewhere around 11 kilometers of using an e-bike. The battery capacity is around 50 kilometers plus. So they're not using this high level of intensity of battery use on their personally owned e-bike. So there could be some space for a little bit of everything, a little bit of both, where a lot of these urban very short trips can be met by, which is the predominant trip for most people, can be met by a bike share type system, whereas people with the long commutes from suburban, rural areas into the cities and so on. You see some of these folks, the laborers and so on, are using e-bikes, and you can see they're coming from a long way away to get into the town, into the city. So they would not probably benefit from a bicycle sharing system like I showed, rather a heavier duty e-bike that has some range. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, this is about batteries, but about the spaces for the e-bike sharing.
Right.
This is a big problem there.
Yeah, so that's a kind of a big management problem. And one of the interesting things I saw in Shanghai, for example, is they're partitioning all this new space for these bike share bikes that has been formally relegated back to the pedestrian or back to the car, one or the other. So that's starting to come back, and it's a management problem because personally owned e-bikes end up parked in structures at shopping centers and residential complexes and so on. They take a lot of space still. So I think in an environment where you have so much density, so much demand, that's cyclical and so on, you can manage it. I'm a proponent and fan of shared mobility systems, especially in a place like China that's got just so much going on. So I think shared mobility definitely has a place in China, but nonetheless, personally owned e-bikes are going to be there too. Okay. A lot of cities, I didn't really talk about this, are banning electric bikes. Okay, and so that was kind of the impetus of why we got into this in the first place. Was Beijing said, we're banning electric bikes. We don't like them. They're not. One of the quotes in one of the Chinese newspapers is they don't keep with the image that Beijing wants to project in advance of the world, in advance of the Olympics. And so the question when you ban a mode is what happens to those people. They don't just disappear. They don't. Their travel demand doesn't go away. It goes to other modes. So it's there are cities doing that today. Shenzhen, Guangzhou are trying to prohibit certain modes like e-bikes. So.
You mentioned the range anxiety influencing the choice of electric vehicles. Do you have any sense of what it would take in terms of battery life or charging station distribution to overcome the anxiety that people already have?
Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Haven't really looked at the sort of infrastructure side. That's kind of we focused a lot on the demand side, not as much on the supply side throughout our research here. But I think that we can start to identify what these barriers in demand are, then we can start to use that to plan for the infrastructure side. There's not with the e-bikes. There's a bit of bike share. I liked that picture that was on the cover. That's an interesting little gadget that's starting to pop up in a lot of Chinese areas. Is you have these coin-operated recharging facilities. Most of the time, I see them empty, but nonetheless, they exist to overcome this either range problem where users have charging problems at the end of their trip, or more often it seems like they're used by people that don't have reliable plug-in location at their home. Okay, so you're thinking about some of these migrants who are coming in from outside the city or living in less formal housing that doesn't have a dedicated parking structure for bicycles and so on. Then they have to plug in wherever they're working and so on. Okay, so there's not nearly as much EV infrastructure that's public for charging e-bikes that you might expect for having so many of them. Almost everybody plugs in at home. Some plug in at work. And by at work, I mean like at the power strip outside of their job, not at a public space. Saw some EV car share cars in Shanghai and a little bit of infrastructure there, but not much. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you showed also pictures about in Shanghai. There are so many different kinds of like private companies investing in the bike sharing.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, what do you think their rationales for doing that? And it seems like lots of competition pushing more and more. And how do they make money?
Yeah, that's a. I don't have a seat at the executive board table or whatever, so it's purely speculative. But a little context: those Bikeshare bikes, they rent by the use, and they're like pennies per rental. They're less than 1 renminbi, which is 12 cents or 15 cents. Some are much cheaper than that per rental. So there's really no. The business case for Bikeshare by itself does not exist yet, okay? But it's similar to Uber and all these other transportation companies that are trying to sweep in, grab as much market share as they can, and use the platform use the transportation platform as a platform for other things in the tech ecosystem. WeChat, you can do almost everything with the sort of WeChat app. It's got the social media, the point of sale, and everything. They're trying to sort of grab your entire life and put it into its ecosystem, including the transportation element of getting around. Not to mention all the data they're probably gathering from you when you check out their bikes and go place to place and so on. So I think that part is kind of supplementing the model, essentially. There's hundreds of millions of dollars in investment from these app companies going into these bike share companies, trying to just smother competition by overrunning cities with their bikes. And like I said, my friends in Kunming were WeChatting me, Chinese middle class, worked their way up, 2-car households, haven't ridden a bike in years, and they're just excited that these cool high-tech bikes are in their neighborhood, and now they're commuting with these bike share bikes and so on. So it's a change in perspective, I think, for the bicycle industry. Hopefully that persists, and hopefully the negative part comes out. And I have no idea beyond grabbing market share and all of your information that they can. The business case for the bikes as a transportation service, yeah.
I have a question from one of our online students.
Okay.
So they were wondering, even though your research is based on e-bikes and car sharing in China, do you see any lessons that can be applied to the U.S., or how can this research be applied in other places?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that first of all, e-bikes, I think, are moving across from east to west. They're relatively large in European cities now, and part of the sort of bicycling ecosystem in a lot of European cities, Germany and Northern European, Copenhagen, Amsterdam, and throughout the Netherlands. They're something like, John can help me, 1 in 4 or something is the going number right now of new bike sales in the Netherlands are e-bikes, okay? And then they're keeping going west, eventually making it to the U.S. And so I think that e-bikes are starting to come in. There's a lot of the same policy questions that China has been grappling with for the last decade. Where do e-bikes go? How fast should they go? What types of, where should they fit in the transportation system is a real question that a lot of agencies are dealing with right now. A lot of states are passing legislation, and John and I are working on that with the people that are doing that work. And they need research to answer those questions. Are they safe? Are they safe on shared use paths? Are they safe on sidewalks? Should you wear a helmet? And so on. And so that's, we're trying to learn some of the questions from what China has learned over the years and then what Europe is learning as well. But I think the other part is really understanding, trying to use some of the similar methods to understand how new technologies like this can impact U.S.-based transportation systems that are maybe a little more entrenched, less dynamic, but we're getting more and more dynamic every day, I think. So.
So you described this environmental justice issue between cities and counties, rural areas. What about within cities? Are there wealthier enclaves where you see less e-bike use or more e-bike use? Are there corridors where, say, lower class workers are using e-bikes more? What are the spatial dynamics within cities?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We did, unfortunately, the spatial sort of emissions models we used didn't allow us to sort of get into these microenvironments and understand where the pollution was coming from and going to. Certainly there are microenvironments or even large environments in Chinese cities that are poorer than others. A lot of cities, though, do have this kind of very mixed, I mean, there's poor pockets, but they're mixed within the city, okay? Less so than the poor side of town and the richer side of town. But we didn't get into that. We said if you're in we basically have the resolution of a county, which is smaller than, it's slightly bigger than a city in a sense, but we can capture that information there.
Not the environmental issue.
Okay.
Just maybe about commuting patterns.
Yeah, so I'll have to try to recall, but from the spatial perspective, we do have data on where people live and where they work and so on. We don't, obviously, the very rich car-oriented suburbs don't see a lot of e-bikes there by the residents of those communities, but you see them by everybody that supports those communities, the people that work in those communities, essentially. So they're ubiquitous in most places. You're seeing more. There's anecdote. You're seeing a lot of these small electric vehicles in the suburban areas. A lot of times, rural areas rely on these sorts of vehicles for more mobility, for where you don't have that compact development as much. And so, but those are anecdotal sort of observations. When we did a bunch of interviews of these owners of these things, so that'll be something coming out down the line. And everybody's saying you got to go to the suburbs to find those. You just can't find them in the city. So we trolled around the suburbs of the cities that we were looking at, trying to find those vehicles to intercept the owners of them. And we found some. We found as many in the cities, I think, as well, though, frankly. So, the e-bikes are ubiquitous, it seems like, in a lot of places. And more down the socioeconomic scale than they used to be. You see construction workers in hard hats now, where before they were riding their bicycles, riding e-bikes. So it's kind of spread throughout the spectrum, whereas the first adopters were kind of middle income, middle class commuters. Okay. Yep.
Thanks, Dr. Cherry.
Okay. Great.
So join us next week for our last transportation seminar of the school year, and just note that your Dropbox is now open for your reflections or papers that are due on